Greetings, my dear students, and welcome to another session of Literary Theory class. We were discussing the history of English studies and how English developed as an academic subject. So, let's continue. The conventional reading of the subject of English begins in 1850s with Matthew Arnold. So, you should remember the dates. It is in the 1850s that the conventional, the usual or the normal reading of English began. It started with Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold is a poet and critic who belongs to the Victorian era. Victorian era, as you all know, and we've seen earlier that it is from 1832 to 1901, extends from 1832 to 1901, Victorian era, and obviously Matthew Arnold is a Victorian poet and critic. He was an inspector of schools too. Inspector of schools, what does that mean? One who does inspection in schools, one who examines whether a school is running smoothly or functioning smoothly or not. So that is an inspector of schools. And the teaching of English had several motives, objectives or goals. And what were those motives? The teaching of English had motives, we saw, and let's see those motives. First one is the Victorian mixture of class guilt about social inequalities. In the Victorian period, there was a sense of guilt feeling among the people because there were class divisions. What is class divisions? Separation based on caste, religion, race. That is class divisions. So people had a guilt feeling about class inequalities and they wanted to get rid of it, and they thought that studying English or developing English as an academic subject will help them get rid of these class inequalities. So the first one was Victorian mixture of class guilt about social inequalities, the first motive of the teaching of English. And the second one was missionary zeal to spread culture and enlightenment. What is missionary zeal? Missionary is, you know what a missionary is. Christian missionaries, you must have heard. A missionary is a person sent to a foreign country for teaching Christianity. So a person who teaches Christianity in another country, in a foreign country, is a missionary. Not just teaching Christianity, they see to it that there's an overall development of the people of the area, whether it be regarding health issues or education. They try to uplift that community, and that is a Christian missionary. Again, they spread Christianity. Along with that, they try for the enhancement or the upliftment of the society or the people of that particular area. So there was a missionary zeal. Zeal is an energy. So missionary zeal to spread culture and enlightenment. So those were the two motives of the teaching of English as an academic subject. This conventional reading of English reaches its height with the publication of the New Bold Theory. And New Bold Theory was on the teaching of English, and it was in 1921 that this New Bold report was written. So, as we told, the conventional reading of English, of the subject of English, reaches its height with the publication of New Bold Theory. And this New Bold report on the teaching of English was in England in the year 1921. In the industrial cities, which were those industrial cities? Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield and Leeds. In these industrial cities, there were university colleges, and university colleges had university degrees from London. Here, London university degrees were taught by external license. So, in the industrial cities like Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Sheffield and Leeds, there were university colleges But in these university colleges, London university degrees were taught by external license from outside. Later, these places, that is, these universities in these industrial cities, eventually became universities in their own right. So, initially, they were offered London University degrees with external license, but later, over the time, these places eventually became universities in their own right. They tried to gain some kind of autonomous functioning. There was a spread of subject at the degree level, that is at the level of graduation. However, Oxford and Cambridge universities were suspicious of the new subject of English. As the subject of English developed, Oxford and Cambridge were suspicious of these developments. In the last quarter of the 19th century, that is from 1875 to 1900, that is the last quarter of the 19th century, there were discussions to establish a chair in English at Oxford. So, in the last quarter of 19th century, as we saw, there were discussions. What were those discussions based on? To establish a chair in English at Oxford. They wanted a chairperson or a professor to preside over the functioning at Oxford, and they wanted a chair in English. And the first attempt on this was in 1887. So it was in the year 1887 that the first attempt was made to establish a chair in English at Oxford. Now there was Edward Freeman, who was a professor of history, and he was against this decision. He did not like Edward Freeman, who was a professor of history, did not like this decision to establish a chair in English at Oxford. And there was another problem too. What was the problem? This problem has never been entirely resolved in the subject of English or in the language of English. It was that early advocates of English, early advocates, Vakilamanal advocates, one who supports is advocating. So, early advocates of English wanted to separate literature from language study. So, one who supported, there were people who supported the study of English and they wanted to separate literature from language study. They felt that literature and language study was entirely different. You have to separate those, you have to distinguish between those, that is literature and language study, and study as separate streams of activity or separate streams of knowledge. Freeman's response was thus: what is meant by distinguishing literature from language? If literature is meant by the study of great books and not mere chatter about Shelley. Now, what does this mean? He said, what is meant by distinguishing literature from language study or language? What is the point in distinguishing literature from language study? If literature is meant by the study of great books, for studying literature, we are studying great books, isn't it? So, how can we separate literature from language study? Because when you study great books, that is, when you examine or when you study in depth great books, it has a medium of language to convey. There was a particular language, that is English, to convey the messages in those great books. So that means it is language study. So to study literature, you have to depend on great books, and those great books had the medium of English to convey the messages. So, how can you separate literature from language study of great books? Well, you cannot. And that's why Freeman won the argument. Freeman's argument was won, and there was the conclusion that literature had to be studied along with language. Literature had to be studied along with language study, otherwise it would not be an academic subject at all. So, in the year 1894, when English course was finally set up at Oxford, it contained historical language study, that is Anglo-Saxon, Gothic, Lato-Slavonic and Middle English. So, In the year 1894, English course was set up at Oxford, and they had to study historical language also. That is, language study was included along with literature, obviously. And historical language study had Anglo-Saxon, Gothic, later Slavonic and Middle English as its contents. In 1920s, in the Cambridge English School, English was given a greater sense of direction. So English was given a greater sense of direction. It had a focus in 1920s in the Cambridge English School. There was a reason for this. Cambridge English was the most recently founded, that is from 1911. So it was only in the later period of 1911 that Cambridge English was founded. And because it was recent, it did not have a tradition to fight against. It did not have any kind of traditional background. So they did not have to fight against anything. It was recent. It was new. And thus, since it was new, the change was easy for Cambridge English. The engineers of this change were a group of people who began teaching at Cambridge in 1920s. So in 1920s, there were a group of people who began teaching at Cambridge, and those people, those teachers were the engineers of this change. Why were they called engineers? Engineers are people who design structure or a machine, and here engineer means a person who causes or who sets up or who devises change. That is an engineer over here, and engineers of this change were I. Richards, William Emerson and F.R. Lewis. So the engineers of the change at Cambridge were a group of people, and they began teaching at Cambridge in 1920s. Those engineers were I. Richards, William Emerson and F.R. Lewis. I. Richards was the founder of the method of studying English. So, I. Richards is the founder of the method of studying English, and this method made a decisive break between language and literature. We discussed earlier about the contentious issues regarding literature and language study. And this method brought about by I. Richards on the studying of English made a decisive break. And what was a decisive break? He made a break between literature and language study. Let's see how that decisive break was made between literature and language study. Richards pioneered a technique called practical criticism. Pioneered the first in the trail. You do a thing for the first time, that is pioneer. You pioneer, you do it for the first time, that is pioneer. So Richards pioneered the technique called practical criticism. What is this practical criticism? We have to see what is practical criticism, but before that, this practical criticism, this technique called practical criticism, was also the title of his book in 1929. So in 1929, I. Richards released or published a book called Practical Criticism, and there was a technique mentioned in this book, that is practical criticism. And that technique made a break between language and literature. Let's see how this is done. This is making a close study of literature possible. This technique makes a close study of literature possible. One of the facets of liberal humanism, as we came across earlier, that is, you have to separate the text from the context. That is this close study or close reading of the text. We have seen this point earlier. How is this possible? How is a close study of literature possible? This is possible by isolating the text from the context. You isolate or separate the text from the context or the surroundings, and you look closely or you concentrate only on the text. That is the close reading. Rather, you isolate the text from the context. If you are studying, say, Renaissance period, along with its characteristic outlook and social reformation. Say you're studying Renaissance period, and along with the Renaissance period you have to naturally see its characteristic outlook. Outlook is a point of view or attitude, and social reformation, that is social changes it has made. How do you do it? How do you study this Renaissance period? So if you're doing practical criticism, students could learn the techniques of practical criticism and simply analyze the words on the page. So suppose if you're studying Renaissance, just see the techniques or learn the techniques of practical criticism and simply analyze the words on the page. Just concentrate on the words of the page, that is close verbal analysis. You don't have to see the context. Richards argued that there should be much more close attention to the precise details of the text, the clear details of the text. That is what he argued, giving close attention to the precise details of the text. There was a second Cambridge pioneer, and he was a pupil or a student of I.A. Richards, and the second pioneer of Cambridge was William Emerson. As I told you, William Emerson was the pupil, rather student of I.A. Richards. So, I.A. Richards was a tutor or the teacher, and the student or pupil was William Emerson. William Emerson presented his tutor, that is I.A. Richards, with the manuscript of the book which was published in 1930s with the title 7 Types of Ambiguity. What is a manuscript? Manuscript is a handwritten material. So when William Emerson wrote a book, it was a manuscript, and the book was 7 Types of Ambiguity, and he published the book in the year 1930s, but the manuscript he first presented to his teacher, that is I.A. Richards. The book was 7 Types of Ambiguity, and in this book, that is 7 Types of Ambiguity, there was Richards' method of close verbal analysis. In this book, that is 7 Types of Ambiguity, William Emerson used or applied the method called Richards' method, and this method is close verbal analysis, the close reading as we came across before. Now we should know what ambiguity means. Ambiguity is uncertainty regarding a particular word or subject. It means doubtfulness. There is a doubtful element in whatever you say or express or write. That is ambiguity. Let's just make it clear with a sentence. Let's make it clear with an ambiguous sentence. So I take a very simple example. Flying planes are dangerous. Now what does this sentence mean? First I can interpret the meaning as to fly planes is dangerous. When I fly planes, whether it be a toy or a plane which may be a toy and it has sharp edges, it means that to fly planes, when I fly planes, it is dangerous for the children. Say for example, we are just supposing, all these are propositions. Okay, I'm proposing things. So to fly planes, when I fly planes, it is dangerous. It may hit somebody or it may hurt somebody. So that is dangerous. That is the first meaning. Okay. The second one, I can interpret that flying planes are dangerous. That is the planes which are already flying in the sky above us aerially can be dangerous. There are planes already flying, see planes which are flying, and that can be dangerous to us. It may fall down, maybe it is harmful to children, or it might not have a control. So the planes which are flying above us in the sky aerially may be dangerous. So there are two meanings that I can interpret. So the meaning is doubtful, it is ambiguous, it is an ambiguous sentence. So that is ambiguity. I hope it is clear. That is ambiguity. And Emerson identified 7 types of verbal difficulty in poetry. Emerson identified 7 types of verbal difficulty in poetry. The title of his book was 7 Types of Ambiguity, and he identified 7 types of verbal difficulty in poetry, which is what he meant by ambiguity. This difficulty is equivalent to ambiguity. And he gave examples in the book with worked analysis. Another Cambridge critic was F.R. Lewis. Yes, another Cambridge critic was F.R. Lewis, and let's see what F.R. Lewis's stand was regarding this subject. F.R. Lewis said in a review that it is a highly disturbing book. That is 7 Types of Ambiguity by William Emerson was a highly disturbing book because it uses intelligence on poetry. Actually, poetry is meant for appreciation. You don't have to use so much of intelligence. Of course, a lot of thinking goes on it, but you don't have to use intelligence on it. There's no so much of intellect. It's much of imagination, thinking, thoughts, and also romanticism. And he says that it uses intelligence on poetry as if it were mathematics. Poetry is not something like mathematics. It is not to the point or to the value. It is something of appreciation. So according to F.R. Lewis, he says it was highly disturbing and uses intelligence in poetry as if in mathematics. Not everybody liked this ultra close form of reading. So everybody did not like this ultra close form of reading, that is close reading or focus reading. The modern poet T.S. Eliot of Wasteland fame, he wrote the poem Wasteland, called this as Lemon Squeezer's School of Criticism. So T.S. Eliot addressed this close form of reading as lemon squeezer school of criticism. You're squeezing, you're squeezing, or you're closely observing something, you're interpreting something close, you're concentrating on it and identifying each intricate issues on it. So you're squeezing something out. You're not just appreciating poetry or a form of literary text, you're squeezing it out. So T.S. Eliot addresses this close reading as lemon squeezer school of criticism.